within the communities that you live in, that you work in, that you're a part of, what are those typical issues that people are dealing with?
Well, I think if I'll jump right in, probably there's a couple of things that I think are across the board. One is the demise of the family structure, particularly as it relates to fathers. Fathers being forced out of the homes, inability to find reasonable jobs, not getting training, the pipeline to prison. But there's been an assault on families of color for some years. And I think every community in the United States has experienced that across cultural groups.
Yeah, I would have to agree. You know, we definitely have seen an increase, at least in Indian country through the work that I've done, an increase in incarceration in both men and women. And, you know, typically in the past it's been men, and now we have seen a huge increase over the last probably 5-10 years of women being incarcerated. And we're talking federal prison, you know, not just local jail as well. So, but that is tied into all the other issues, you know, I wouldn't say smaller issues, but all the many other issues that are there: drugs, alcohol, domestic violence, suicide. You know, a lot of those different issues that are prevalent in the work that we do.
And a lot of those things, they all, in my view, and looking at a lot of my friends, I'm a single father of 5. A lot of my friends don't have that ability to take on that challenge, I guess you could say, of raising a child on their own. It's because they don't know. They've ran that pipeline through prison. They've dabbled in the drugs and the alcohol, and they've fathered children that some are now. I will say some of them are stepping up to the plate, but they're just now doing that, and they're in their 40s, late 30s, but they're just now starting to understand what it means to be a father.
I think that's really critical, because I think having a child is probably the most important thing and problematic thing we will do in our lives, and the activity for which we're the least prepared. And in many ways, we don't think about it in process.
Exactly.
We don't think about it at the time. We're usually, and there's something in the culture that tells us to think about it. We simply procreate, and this, now what? But I think that's common across the states. I think people kind of parent by the seat of their pants, and later on we figure some things out. And what that suggests to me is we've got to start having some conversation about what it means before we impregnate. Realize if you're going to be an involved father, your life has changed immediately and drastically and forever. And you need to know that. And if you don't want to be a father, then don't procreate. Use protection, be sexually responsible until you are ready. But we don't have those conversations until, as you're saying, those men are 40. And they can then begin to get it. They don't probably want any more kids anyway. But we have to have the conversation with 8 and 9 and 10 and 12-year-olds, and we've got to model behavior.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the big things I hear from a lot of my dads is a lot of dads just feel that the system doesn't really offer supports to them. A lot of dads feel invisible. The rights of unmarried fathers, and I'm not a father's rights guy, but if a mom and dad aren't married, dads don't have legal access to their children, but they have to pay financial support for their children. And I understand that dads need to support their children, but to not be able to raise that child, not to have access to that child, I think the system itself just has a lot of biases. And I was just at an event just last week. There were 2,400 people at the Kroc Center, and there was a child that was lost, and they made the announcement, there's a motherless child here. Yes. And I just got sad, and I thought, yes, that child is lost, but why do they perpetuate that this child has no mother, but don't even think about the dad? So part of it is the invisibility of the system that doesn't expect much of dads. Part of it is the system doesn't provide many supports for dads. I'm not saying they have to have as many as they do for moms, but have something there that says fathers are welcome, have a man's face, have staff that understand paternal instincts and that understand the psychology of men. And you're going to have more guys coming asking for help once they get over that barrier. Right. But the system has to say men are worthy as fathers to receive assistance. And it's not a threat to moms. It's an embellishment, and it helps the whole family.
At least it should be that way. Yeah, I think a lot of mothers may not see it as anything more than a threat. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think this has been a problem for quite a while.
I think the system also has trained men into that type of thinking as well, that, well,
Yes.
if, I'm not with my child's mom and I can't afford my child support, then I don't have access to my child. And so I'm going to, just kind of stay back until I can support. But really, it's what you see is for those men that tend to pay child support, they're more involved. So, and that's one of the things, systematically that, I think needs to be changed as well. What can the system do to help make those child support payments, other things, reasonable and realistic, so that fathers can be involved with their children.
There are other things too. Hey, sitting here thinking about the scenario or the what happened there. I thought about this, and it was my daughter who actually brought this to my attention. She says, "Dad, how come dads aren't more visible in media?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "I watched Toy Story with my younger daughter." She says, "And I noticed that they never had a dad. It was always the mother that the child was referring to. It was always, there was never a father there." And I thought, that's true in all three of those movies. And I started to notice other things as well. And I thought to myself, well, it's no wonder that there's, you have the system out there. You have that where single fathers are not portrayed until recently. You have some sports figures saying, I care for all of my kids. This is an image that I have, but that doesn't mean that I don't take upon my responsibilities as a father. And the story that we just heard up here in the conference, he's a rapper. He was on the verge of maybe going worldwide, and he had the tattoos, and he had the earrings, and he had the glasses, and he had the watch, and I don't know if he had a pinky ring, but that would have been cool. But I thought to myself, there is someone who you would, the image, he's not portrayed as, his image is not someone that you would usually see as a caring, loving father. And when you got to know him, that's exactly what he was. And I take a look at my friends, and some of those friends of mine, and they are the same way. They look that way. They have the tattoos. They have the piercings. They have all of those things. But they're starting, like I said, to realize what it is to be a father, what it is to care for their child. So that imagery,
that's critical. That's critical.
A lot of these things are symptoms of an issue that we have. Where did this start? I mean, what's missing today? How do we go from, use media as an example, how do we go from my 3 sons to, or Full House even, bringing it up through the 80s, to something like you just described, where, today we have shows where the dad is non-existent. I mean, Toy Story, you don't even hear about Dad. It's not that he's not in the picture. You just don't hear about him.
Or he's a buffoon.
That's
the other big one.
that's,
Whether it's on The Simpsons or on any of the shows, the dads are a buffoon. That a lot of times it's showing a mom telling dad how to be a dad.
That's right. That's right.
So
But that's the culture, because essentially, and I'll have to blame my discipline for part of that, because psychology is a big problem in terms of denying the worth, the value of men in home. Children are the primary prover of mothers. For any of the men any of the populations we've ever worked with, it is highly unlikely you would hear somebody say, "I don't have a father. I don't have a mother." But I hear people, males and females, saying all the time, "I don't have a father." And I said, unless your father's deceased, you have a father. You had a father if he's deceased. But to say, "I don't have a father," what is that about? And I don't hear that about mothers. I think what we have to do is to start to have a real honest dialogue about what that is about. The other piece that I think fits in with men of color, at least, is that if in fact we're talking about fathers' primary responsibility as financial provision for families, you've locked out a huge population, because essentially they're talking about middle-class white norms, and that doesn't fit us. So even as my father worked his life as a janitor, hell of a good father, but if I look at that criteria, he wasn't good. He didn't make the money that's required. So we've got to start thinking about that conversation in different ways, because those men who are pushed out of the culture, or pushed out of the society in terms of learning potential, still are adequate fathers. I would argue, in fact, the more important thing is to learn how to take care of your kids. I have no argument, like you, about the need to financially provide. But for me, that's really secondary in terms of what fathers are about. So the men I work with, that's my message to them. Yes, I want you to work. Yes, you have to pay bills, but you need to love that child. You need to nurture. You need to be in close proximity. You need to parent on a daily, ongoing basis.
And I think that's exactly what needs to happen in terms of educating not only the men but society as a whole, in that how important involvement is for these men to not just provide financially, but really to be able to live with their children, to interact with their children, to be aware of what's going on in the lives of their kids, because kids are great at hiding things.
Yes.
But really, if you look at just how huge of a problem this is, our federal government and governments throughout the world are throwing billions and billions of dollars into these programs to help fight the results of fatherlessness. Dad's not in the home, so you got psychological problems, you got teen pregnancy, you got dropouts, you're runaway. All of these things can really be diverted in a good number of cases if the father was involved.
I think part of it means we need to start young. When I was in Minnesota, one of the things we tried to do was try to get the state legislature to require that all school districts offer 1 semester of parent education and child development. Not that students had to take it, but if you offer parent education and child development, and then you find the indigenous leaders, some of the guys on the athletes or whoever, and have them start taking it at a young age, that being a father isn't just an accident, but it's something you prepare for and you aspire to. And when I talk about starting young, when my daughter, who's now 18, was her second Christmas, she was 16 months old, I'd ordered her a tape from Hasbro that had 6 songs on it. And one of the songs was the alphabet song. A is for apple. I'm not going to try and sing. B is for baby. And the G was for grandma, and the M was for mommy. But in the alphabet song, the whole 26 letters, the D was for doggy, the P was for puppy. In the 26 letters, I listened to it with my daughter, and she liked it. And I went through a second time. And not one letter in the alphabet had a representative father. It had mom and grandma, but no dad or papa. And I just got so sad, and then I got frustrated that you would have a tape that they'd send to children that wouldn't expect a father's presence. So the system is part of the problem. We guys ourselves, we need to have more men working with men. I really think that's a big one. So that we can recruit more men like these guys, like us, to see that this is an honorable field, that we're going to work with young dads, we're going to work with guys coming out of prison, we're going to work with dads re-entering after the military, where we're going to recruit men who are capable, but we're going to help them find out how they can be better dads, not how we tell them, but how they are. But the system needs to support that, and right now there are very few resources that say help dads is an honorable profession.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, and that's so true about teaching young men to be that type of person, that just a good person in general, that's going to be able to, that's going to be goal oriented, that's going to be able to take care of themselves first. And that's what I tell my son. My son is 19 years old and he has a girlfriend, and I told him, be careful of what you do when you're alone together. I said, I know that you're gonna spend time together, you're gonna be alone, and that's okay. That's gonna happen. That's a choice that you make. But be conscious of the choices that you make when you start to become intimate together.
Yes.
And I told him why. I said, I'm gonna tell you why. When you get to that point where you're intimate with a woman, I said, there's so much more than just the act.
That's right.
And there's so much more than just, oh yeah, I did it. I have a girlfriend. This is her. I'm going to show her off. It's much more than that. There's a lot. There's feelings that come and that are shared between the both of you. I said, if you're not able to handle those feelings on your part as a man, it's going to be difficult for the relationship to grow and to work.
That's right. And you become part of a problem.
Yes, and you become part of the problem, and eventually you'll break, and you'll go. And whether you decide to become bitter from the breakup or learn from it, that's a choice that you're going to make. But I tell him, I said, I'm sitting here telling you, you need to learn from every experience that you have, so that when you do find, and I told him, I said, I'm not saying that she isn't the one. I said, but if you should decide to move on to another relationship, at least you'll know not to make the same mistakes, or at least be aware of what happened in the one previous.
Pacer, you mentioned that you're raising your son, and the things that we, as men, we're supposed to teach our sons, and from a cultural perspective, those are things that are not in place anymore. The ceremony, even just down to teaching your child, your son how to do the craft work, those types of things.
The rites of
You know,
passage.
the
Yeah,
rites of
yes,
passage
yes,
they're missing
yes,
throughout all
Yeah.
cultures, and that plays a huge role in what my
Absolutely.
role as a young man transitioning into a male adult. What my responsibility is, not just to myself or to my family, but really to the community.
That's right.
You know, to the
That's
rest
right.
of everybody else. You know,
Absolutely.
where do I fit in, and what does that mean? That's not there anymore.
I'm reminded of, I'm dating myself now, but I remember April 4 of 1967 when my oldest daughter was born, and the reaction I had. And I'm sitting there looking at this. Look at this perfect human being. Look at this perfect hand. Look at this perfect nose, etc. And it hit me. I can't be the only man in the world that has those feelings. And I was in graduate school at the time. So I decided I was going to pursue my graduate training looking at fathers. And this is 1967. I was told, and this is, memory is getting kind of raggedy as I'm aging, but something along the line, it's interesting, but it's not really valuable for you. It's not a viable area of clinical inquiry. End of story. So I did a piece of mundane research to get my doctorate, and immediately started working with fathers and ran into the same thing. So in 1970, I started my work with fathers, and there was huge walls every step I took, except the men came in. So the wall was not with the men. The wall was with other things out there. I mean, I never ran across a man that indicated he did not love his child. I would hear men talk about, I don't know what to do. The hospitals didn't train, they will train mothers, young mothers. They don't train fathers. So I kept trying to push on that. Still pushing on it. It's like 80 years later, we're having the same conversations and the same problems. So the society at large is really not interested in pushing the agenda, so it really does behoove us to do that.
So we talked a little bit about culture and tradition, and in some regards, indigenous peoples. Is there a place that we can go to with regards to culture? Like, where does culture is a tough, that's a tough word because it has so many different meanings, and where does it really start, right? So, and traditions, where do traditions really start? Because the traditions from 500 years ago are not the same traditions from 1,000 years ago, right? And the traditions that we observe today are not necessarily the same traditions that we may have observed 25 years ago, or 50 years ago. So it's something that's constantly changing, but is there a thread that we can follow? And in Indian country, it's very apparent to see that there's a lot of people holding on to what they want to be as traditions. African Americans have struggled for centuries now to either regain or create new traditions, just to feel that sense of community. What are we missing? What can we be adding to, or where can we go to? What are you guys seeing as sort of the front lines in that culture war, if you will? Because it does seem like there's not just this idea of the loss of culture. We talk about rites of passage, which are indigenous to every culture on the planet, and we've all but lost those, except in very primitive cultures.
And they may not be as primitive as we want them to
Right.
be.
And
but I ever just say it exactly. No, I think that really is important that came out, because I think as social scientists, we do that a lot. So I really appreciate your saying that, and I appreciate you're not meaning it in that way. But I think a lot of folks are without saying it, and that becomes part of the problem, because that's primitive, and we really are advanced. And the reality is, no, we're not that advanced. We do some kind of bizarre things that are really problematic. But in my case, from the African American community, probably the major strength was the extended family. Now, I found out later on, I was fortunate, I guess, because my father was present in my life. But social science became a problem with that, because I went to college, I was told I did not have a father. And these were from white professors. I said, well, who was that man that was living at home with my mother? I thought that was my father all this time. And I actually remember talking with him, and he looked at me, and my father was 8th grade educated. I remember talking with him, and he said, you're going to school to get stupid. And I said, Dad, not me. I'm questioning this, but that's what professors are talking about. He said, that doesn't make any sense. So not only was my dad in my life, so were 3 uncles on my mother's side and my maternal grandfather. So men were around. That's what I expected. I saw that as my responsibility. I'm a father of daughters. And it kind of hit me, okay, this is new, what do I do? Well, the reality is men are needed to treat daughters, to train daughters how men who care about women treat them. So you have a lot of work as a father of 2 daughters. I have 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. And that's exactly what I do. They see me interact with their mother, their grandmother, and that's a daily thing. And I remember my father interacting with my mother. So that became a tradition for me. And all that ties into, in terms of where I'm living, is we developed what is called a brotherhood of elders. So old African-American men who are about to retire or should retire or have retired have decided to come together. And our group has grown from 4 to 37, where we are involved in community activities, giving back. We accept the fact that we talk about the youth failing. The reality is the adults have failed the youth. So we owe some things to the kids to give back, and we meet every other Saturday, talk about what we need to do, and give those things back to tie in with tradition. Mentoring is a big one. Tradition is a big one. Rites of passage are all big issues that we do.
So, if society is a barrier in that regard, and I'm sorry, I don't want. I just right. If there are certain elements of society that's a barrier, how do we get society to accept those things? You'll hear oftentimes from teenagers, "Well, that's just so old-fashioned," right? I used to say it a lot, especially when it came to religion, right? Oh, those are old-fashioned ideas, right? But now that I'm older, I've come to realize
Wiser.
they're not so old-fashioned.
They're just traditional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a lot of this problem that we're talking about with society being a bit of a barrier. So with society, and I mean, and certainly in Indian country, we see a lot of society being a barrier to culture.
I do think it's getting better. I've been working dads as long as you have, but I started Father's Resource Center in 1990 in Minneapolis, and I've been working with dads full-time since then. When I first started and I said I was working with dads, people went, why? Now, there's at least an expectation that somebody somewhere, like in the Valley, there are 4 programs that work with fathers out of for 6 million, I don't know, but we at least expect now that there are going to be some resources. So I think part of it is changing. I think a part of it also is we guys ourselves. Most men that I come across are left-brained, and we're very trained to do that win-lose. And when you go the win-lose, which being a Vikings fan, it's lonely, but I'm always winning when I'm watching the Vikings. But when it comes to relating to my children, I have to go to win-win. When I have to have an argument, disagreement with my wonderful wife, I have to think, no, it's not win-lose. I don't want her humiliated. I don't want her losing and me winning. I need to shift to the win-win.
Yes.
And I don't want to sound patronizing, but I've noticed in the native culture, I see a lot of men are very more right-brained. They are more win-win. And I think we could learn from that, because a lot of the guys that I don't have my kids, so I have to sue. I didn't get this job, so I have to. That win-lose mentality is appropriate, but we need to teach boys there are arenas where we need to go to the win-win, where everybody. That's not wishy-washy. That's not feminine. That's not wrong. It's just that there are 2 winners or more than 2 winners. And some young men have a tough time with that because they think the whole world is to compete. And when you work in nonprofits, it is more cooperative, and in the for-profit world, it's competitive. So I think part of it is men working with men to say, this is the time that everybody can win, and that's honorable, and that's masculine.
Yes, and they need to see us with that as also.
That's important to teach the men that, you know, there's always a brighter side to anything that happens. As was mentioned in the keynote this morning, you know, things, they get rough, you know, times get tough, but, you know, we have to be able to maintain that composure to know that we can get through these things. You know, that things, you know, the sun will shine again after the storm, so to speak. And when we have the ability to do that, the maturity to be able to do that, then we're teaching our young children that that's what happens. And what we see in Indian country now also, you know, throughout many of the reservations is, you know, people have a huge chip on their shoulder. There's a lot of anger, you know, to the non-native community. And so that in itself can create a barrier as well. But I wanted to go back real quick and to your question, Frank, about, you know, tradition. You know, that's changed. You know, each family has its own tradition, right? And over time, that has changed. You know, going back, you know, when we're talking about fathers, going back to the industrialization age, you know, removing dad from the home now. Now he's not a farmer. You know, he's not hunting. He's actually going to a factory to work. So you remove him out of the house. That changed the dynamic of the family, and so tradition then started as well. I'm not saying that that was a change for tradition, but you know, and so we see that happen, you know, in our native communities, and that's when those cultural traditions, the older practices, started to change as well. Now we have men leaving the reservation to go find work, so they're not participating in the ceremony, in the activities, and so the family tradition, the dynamic, that change, you know, that changes there. And so if we're not teaching this way of life that we all have, and that's really what it comes down to. It's a way of life. You know, we talk about tradition and culture, but it really is just a way of life. It's how we lived our lives.
Yes.
We don't teach that. We don't model that anymore. And so that part that we call tradition, you know, is not there anymore to the extent that it used to be, when all it really is just how I live my life, you know, modeling for our kids.
Yeah, and that's so true. Kevin brought up some good points there with the industrialization of the United States and you know, the reservation system. And for us here in Salt River, the turning over of our farms to farming groups or organizations or companies, that took away the tradition of farming. The men were farmers first, and we used that role to teach our sons, to teach our children, and also to remind ourselves that what we're doing is part of a larger system, and that included women, and that including accepting them and honoring their role in raising the children. And that's something that you just don't see. People do walk around with the chip on their shoulders. There's the frustration and the anger, frustration at the system, frustration at, you know, not being able to see their child when they want to because of a court order. All of those things that, those traditions that have been removed. You see traditions coming back for the girls. My daughters participated in their coming out ceremonies. A lot of their friends are doing that now. But for my sons, there was never really anything. And there isn't anything. And it wasn't until actually we came to this conference, and we had the presentation from the group down from Tonaoto, who started making that run back to the Sea of Cortez for our men, our young men. And we, it turned out my oldest son's girlfriend is from Tonaoto, and she knows some of those people that have made that trip. And we sat there and talked about it one night. And I told him, I said, I'd like for you to do that. And he says, why? I said, because that's what it was. That's what was needed in order for you to become a man. And we talked further. But I told him, I said, you know, the traditions, everything, the word himdak and doishish for the pipash, himdak for the autumn, way of life. I said, everything is embedded in your traditions. I said, when you start learning those things, I said, maybe not actually doing them, but understanding them. I said, I've never participated in the runs or the ceremonies when I was growing up. I never heard much about the culture and what it meant, you know, the rites of passage or the journey to become a man, the vision quest, all of those things. I said, I read about them and I saw them on TV. I said, but it wasn't until I came back that I wanted to know about them. I said, and it wasn't until I married your mother and we both sat down, and even though we were both LDS, we attended church regularly. I said, we wanted you kids to know more about your traditions and especially your culture, because we felt that was a missing piece of our lives, and we didn't want you kids to go through that. You needed both in order to understand what it is to be a person, just a human being, a person. Whether you were a daughter or a son, I didn't know. I said, I knew you were coming. I said, but that's something that we decided because it would help to guide you. And you know, he's 19 and he has his questions about the world, but I can honestly say that when he does have hard times, he does rely a lot on the things that I taught him as far as traditions are concerned. And it's not everything. I'm certainly not an expert on it because I don't know a whole lot myself. But that little bit for him is enough for him to look at things a little bit differently than his friends.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
I have a question for you guys too. I'd like to get your take on this. You know, you all have well, you guys were there for the keynote this morning. I'm not sure how much of you caught, but you all had a chance to look at the program. You know what this conference is about. How do you think that this type of conference, why is it important for our fathers and for our father, from fatherhood perspective? What makes this conference so important?
Several levels this conference is important. One, to see men interact with men on a very high level. I think that's really critical because a lot of times we don't see that. To hear men grapple with questions, share their background, show their hurt. Keynote speakers certainly talking about that, the pain and agony, and growing from that, a sense of resiliency and growth from that. The idea, the notion of getting together to share ideas about what else is needed in our communities and following up with that. For me, it's really nice to see the men over the years and the different conversations that have taken place that really do speak to the growth that I think is so evident. And I think the idea of seeing young people here, and some of the men and moms and dads have brought some of their youngsters, for them to be exposed to this, I think is really critical.
I was telling somebody that I was going to be coming today on the phone, and he said, "That's interesting, men's and women's conference." Because usually you have a men's conference or a women's conference or a parenting conference, and I don't see this in our community, in non-native community. I mean, the idea of having men and women come together to talk about men and women's stuff, I think can be very empowering and very supportive. So I'd like to see this model, in other communities, my community, because we got a lot to work on.
I've said that to Kevin many times, in that this is unique, and I think that if we are still talking about how society views men, and that even Native cultures and African American individual cultures are still affected by the society at large, that society, if it's truly a sort of white middle class society, needs to be part of that conversation. They need that education as well. I think that even people like myself who have been there for my family, and and try to educate myself as a father, still have something to learn, and B, have something to teach.
Oh, what you said there, I think is so critical. I think that other community can learn a lot from us, and I think that gets missed a lot. I think that our journeys, our conversations, the things that we've survived, I think the entire culture can learn from that, and would be nice if they attended to it and then did things differently themselves, because we don't have to keep making these same mistakes. Once we commit to growth, we can do things differently.
Absolutely. Sharing is sharing between cultures it can only strengthen you, and that's one thing that I stress for my nieces and my nephews, as well as my own kids. Go out into the world, go out and do the things that you wanted to do when you were a young child. Learn about others. Learn about what it is. My daughter, she's just now coming out of her shell. She went to a meeting. She didn't know anybody, and the one friend that she was going to be going with ended up backing out. And I told her, I said, it's just an opportunity for you to make friends and to learn about others.
Yes,
Don't be afraid of that, and let them know about you as well.
Yeah.
And that's something I think, speaking from my experience in working with different Native tribes, and that can be difficult sometimes, and that's something that I mentioned this morning when talking to the audience. Going out there and meeting new people and not being so clammed up. And I see that, as in our communities as a whole, sometimes we don't, as a community, go out and, meet other people. We stay to ourselves, and that creates barriers for ourselves, so we create our own barriers sometimes, essentially.
Individually, to each other. Since we're talking about learning from each other, what is one thing that you would want to know more about, or one thing that you've taken from each other that you would so what question, Neil, would you have to ask Pacer about his community, or what he does within that structure of being a father, that would be helpful in what you do? And likewise, Pacer, the same for you. If we can somehow make that happen in 2 minutes, but.
Well, I guess one thing is, when I'm working with fathers of whatever culture, I try to look for the common threads that we would agree are respect for the child's mother, respect for our children. I try and find things that are not going to be offensive, not going to be patronizing, not going to be making assumptions, like that term primitive, that the dominant culture can really hurt people who are not from that. So part of it is I just continue to ask people, what are the focuses that you see are the needs in the community when we're working with fathers? That we've talked about the barriers, but I want to look at the enabling parts. What are the empowering parts that help dads? So I guess that's what I would continue to ask. And then how can we do that together?
Well, I think for me, and this would be for Dr. Connor and Neil here, in working with the men that you all work with, what is the I guess what are some of the more common characteristics of the types of men that are coming in for your services, that are attending your classes? What does that dynamic look like?
Real briefly, we're getting a lot more through CPS. We have a lot of parents who've had children taken away, especially the dads. We had a mom who was living apart from the dad, and the mom had her kids taken away, but they were taken away from the dad too, and they weren't even living together. So the biases. So part of it is a lot of those, and then also we're seeing more foster parents. So when they're in the same room, there's a little conflict.
For me, with First Nation people, I'm really interested in success models. But with all that has happened, and I realize a lot has happened in my community as well, but I feel I can learn from them, but maybe I can take some things back to my own community. But with the very purposeful destruction of a culture and trying to put things back together, there's clearly a lot of strength. And I would like to see more of that, like to hear more about that, would like to observe that. When I watch you interact with your children, don't know you, but I intend to do this if I know, but watching you interact with your children, I do kind of stare at you, watch you, etc., and I'm impressed with that because there's messages there. When you shared, when you took me home, when you shared your culture some years ago, that was really powerful in my life, and I want more of that. And a lot of it is because I think my community can learn from that, because we also have had our culture destroyed, trying to put together who we think we might have been. But I think we can learn from other people who again, the strength model is there. And that's not the way the overall culture works. We look at deficits and push everything in terms of a deficit model. Well, there are a lot of Native people who've been damn successful, not in the sense that maybe the outer culture identifies success, but in terms of sex and on their own grounds. I like to see that. I like to, maybe next have a very purposeful workshop on that to talk specifically about success models that are in the room, that everybody's bringing those with them.
Yeah. Great
And
idea.
that for me, for me it would be, what is it that we can do to bring all of these different organizations that are out there that are just now starting to spring up, that have the same types of questions and the same types of answers and the success models? What can we do? Not necessarily us in this room, but it starts small and grows big. That's how I've always seen it. What can we do to bring this all together in order to put this message out on a broader basis? What can we do to help influence the media a little bit? What can we do as far as even within our own communities and bringing men together? I know that within Salt River, there's Kevin's group. I know the Head Start organization tried to start up their group, men's group. And there was another one that was out there, and I'm not sure if they're still in existence anymore. Maybe not within the community, but outside of the community. But that's where they started. What can we do to bring this together to get that message out there a little bit more?
Yeah.
That would be my question.
Yes.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
I
It's
learned
a
a lot.
pleasure.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
We could do this
yeah.
for another hour and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really.